Hello. Welcome everyone to our webinar, Becoming Social, Learning How. My name is Penny Andersen and I'm really pleased to be with you today as this is a subject that is very dear to my heart. I'd like to introduce my colleagues Nida, Kazmi and Maria Curtis, who's behind the scenes, who will also be bringing you this webinar. So KidsMatter is funded by the Department of Health and Beyond Blue, and ECA is partnering with Beyond Blue and, in school contexts, with Headspace to support whole services in schools in implementing the KidsMatter framework and undertaking the professional learning that goes along with it. So, is your school or service registered and participating in KidsMatter? If you are, the great news is that our webinars will support your progress through the professional learning. And we have a whole series of webinars about to hit the online space over the coming months. So if your school or service isn't registered, we suggest you register. And we've put the link for you to sign up in the chat. Feel free to ask any questions about participation and what is involved in growing healthy minds and well-being. Now, let's get back to today where we will be reflecting about what social learning is and the ways in which being social influences mental health and well-being.
However, before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands that we are meeting on today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and the hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I would also like to acknowledge that Aboriginal communities have a strong history of being social and understanding social rules, especially when I consider the intricacies that are involved in being social within and between kinship groups and countries. Just looking at the map on the screen highlights this for me. As I prepared for this event, I thought about how the social learning of generations has been impacted by the forced removal of Aboriginal children. I was reminded that context, culture, relationships, experiences, and history all influence what we learn about being social, and that being social is connected to our identity, how we live, and our mental health. Penny and I are going to take you through a process of reflecting about social learning, the social learning of our children, ourselves, and how context and culture influences what we know about being social. Today, we encourage you to think about two things that could be built into your reconciliation action plan. Firstly, thinking about the webinar topic in terms of how we can build on from the apology as individuals as well as collectively. And also considering ways to communicate with colleagues, friends, family, and children about how social structures, connections, and intergenerational mental health and well-being has been impacted by the forced removal of children from the stolen generation.
On the screen now, as they come on, you'll see some symbols or ways, and each of these symbols represents a way in which we guide our practice. So first of all, today is about connecting together as we consider early childhood mental health and well-being. And second, to help keep safe today for ourselves, please share only what you feel comfortable sharing via the chat. Be mindful in your responses to others and observe confidentiality and privacy in any stories that you decide to share. We need to make sure we make safe. So as we think and talk and learn together, be aware of the feelings that you might experience. So just think of a plan for what you'll do if any tricky or uncomfortable feelings or thoughts happen to be raised for you today. This might mean, for example, having a yarn with someone who can help or to seek professional support in some way. So we'll put a link to some of that support in the chat. We know that conversation with supportive others is a protective factor for mental health and well-being. So conversation is that last symbol in our group.
We believe it's really important to explore social understanding and skills because these are a significant protective factor for good mental health. During the webinar and afterwards, in the list which will be made available, you'll find links to resources to support your ongoing professional conversations. We often talk about social and emotional development together, but we wanted to explore social development on its own in order to come to a deeper understanding about this area of development and learning. This has been a very interesting process. We have had some conversations that have really challenged our thinking and understanding. In trying to separate the two, we have discovered that it's almost impossible because of the close connection. But in the process, we've learned a lot about social development. We're going to share some of this learning with you today. We'll also continue some of our conversations during the webinar, and we ask you to join in the chat when you can.
Thanks, Nida. We're going to start to set the scene for this webinar by defining what we mean by social learning, describe where social development fits in a child's total development, and then we'll connect this to mental health. So next, we'll explore in more detail what it means to be social and identify the skills and understandings that are needed. So following this, we will explore how we become social, make links to early childhood practice, and finish off by looking at ways we can support the social learning of the children we work with. So let's move on to set the scene for this webinar. So what comes to mind when you hear the term social? Perhaps social scene, socialising, parties, school social, social welfare. The term is used in many, many ways. So we have in mind the statement that social learning is more than taking turns and being friends, which deliberately challenges some of the surface thinking in order to look more deeply at the significance of this particular skill area. And recent research, for example, has made very strong connections between the increase in depression and anxiety and social isolation and difficulties with social skills. So this is a #1 health challenge in our society today. The graphic on your screen, as you can see, organises children's social and emotional skills into 3 core areas. And this will guide us as we look at what each of these terms means and the connections between them. In preparing this webinar, Nida and I talked about whether empathy, for example, is a social or an emotional skill. As I continue, just ponder on what you think the answer to that is. We agreed that empathy includes skills in both areas, and we know that it's artificial to separate social and emotional concepts as they are so intertwined, as shown in the graphic. But we believe, however, that it's helpful to focus a lens on each of them in turn in order to increase our understanding as we strive to support children's mental health, wellbeing and learning. So, as the diagram shows, the areas overlap considerably, and some skills may fall into more than one area, but all of the skills in each of those areas have a strong impact on mental health and wellbeing. And this overlap can be demonstrated, for example, by thinking about empathy a bit further that I raised earlier. So empathy is about understanding your own feelings, and that involves a sense of self and emotional skills, and the feelings of others, so that involves social and emotional skills. But it's also about knowing that another person knows you understand what they are thinking and feeling, and this involves both social and emotional skills. So there's a strong interlinking here. These 3 core areas influence the way we view ourselves and others, how we interact with others, and how we function in the world. They are essential for children's development of good mental health and wellbeing, but they also provide a very useful way to think about, organise, and be intentional about social and emotional learning. Positive social and emotional skills are synonymous with good mental health. So let's set the scene by explaining a little bit further these terms that we're using, and then I'll explore what it means to be social. So first of all, a sense of self is about children's developing capacity to feel positive about themselves and their capabilities. This is very similar to a person's sense of identity. The words developing capacity are particularly important in early childhood, given the enormous amount of learning that takes place. Sorry, I think we've moved on a little bit quickly there, somehow. Right, back to the right side. So the words developing capacity are particularly important in early childhood because so much learning happens in those first years of life. And emotional skills, that second section, refers to children's developing capacity to recognise, express and regulate feelings. We all know how important those are in relation to children's behaviour. Social skills refers to children's developing capacity to interact successfully with others, a very important part of mental health and wellbeing. Some people refer to positive social skills as being pro-social and negative social skills as being antisocial. It's important to remember that some people can find the social world very challenging, and struggling with one or two areas of social understanding can have a major impact on relationships. For today's purposes, we're going to use the term social skill, although we know this includes social understanding, social behaviour, social learning, social competence, social communication, and so on. So social skill is the term that we'll use.
So looking at our next slide, social behavior demonstrates developing capacities to join in, communicate, cooperate, and seek help. But what we see is behavior often. The behaviors are the actions we see that lead us to think, interpret, and wonder about what is happening for children socially and emotionally. Children communicate their social and emotional capacity and a sense of their identity through their behavior, through what they do. Noticing patterns of behavior over time offers clues for planning relevant and meaningful social experiences for a child. For example, at packing away time, you might often see a child underneath a table curled in a ball. Let's call this behavior hiding. Now, please use the chat to let us know what this behavior might be indicating. What do you think is happening for this child? What do you think the child may be thinking or feeling? It is really tempting to judge others by their behavior rather than by their intentions. We judge ourselves by our intentions because we know what we mean. Learning to judge children by their intention is a skill worth developing. Social behavior communicates children's developing social capacities and involves the interplay between a complex network of skills, knowledge, and attitudes. So what does it mean to interact successfully with others? And what does it mean to be social? What are your thoughts on that, Penny?
I think, to me, one of the things that I think about is how important that capacity to interact successfully with others is. And I see it even in my very young grandchildren, how they're always talking about who is my friend and how important this is to them and how it helps them to develop a sense of who they are. So I think that that need to interact successfully with others is established very early. And when children have difficulty in this area, I think we have to really work to help them develop the skills they need to be successful.
Absolutely.
So being social is a very complex area and one that we really need to help children in terms of all the skills that are needed, because it's made up of emotional, cognitive, behavioural and executive functioning aspects. So as the Harvard Centre for the Developing Child explains, the word executive function and self-regulation skills, they're the mental processes that enable us to plan, focus our attention, to remember instructions, and to juggle multiple tasks successfully. Just as an air traffic control system at a busy airport safely manages the arrivals and departures of many aircraft on multiple runways, the brain needs this skill to filter distractions, prioritise tasks, set and achieve goals, and control impulses. So difficulties in this area seriously affect a child's learning because those skills are involved in so much of what we learn. Cooperation, joining in, communication and seeking help are identified as the key social skills. But to further understand this, it's helpful to explore just what happens inside a social interaction. Now, we are biologically wired to relate to others. And in fact, the human species cannot survive alone. Being social is critical to how we function in the world and how we think and feel about ourselves, and in relation to how the brain develops. So research shows us that our social capacity develops within the relationships we have with important people, and this starts from birth and possibly even before. You learn to be social when immersed in social experiences, relationships, and while observing others. I think we sometimes underestimate how much children learn from observing the actions of others. So modelling, the way we model, is really critical. Later experiences build on those that have gone before, and people of all age groups interact and are social with each other. So a child interacting with an educator is using similar social skills as those used with a peer or with their older sibling. And so the foundation for all these interactions is laid down in the early years. And the graphic on this slide represents what being social looks like, what it looks like inside a social interaction, even social interactions that are quite simple. So first of all, up in the right-hand quadrant, the blue one, you'll see that being motivated is absolutely essential for an interaction. So you've got to want to make contact or interact with somebody. And most people are internally motivated. But some people, even though they might be very motivated, like children, want to join in, but they struggle with how do I do this? Or when would I do this? And why would I do this? One of the second things that's important in a social interaction, a pro-social interaction, is knowing how to approach. That's the second quadrant. Is knowing how to approach or join a group to start an interaction. It sounds simple, but joining in is a key social skill for children and some find this challenging. So the third area is responding. And that means responding when someone does approach you to join in. How do you respond? What's the best way to do this? The fourth area is about maintaining contact. And again, that involves a lot of skills. And fifth, changing direction. That's knowing how to change your direction when the social context changes. And then sixth and seventh are knowing when the interaction is actually finished. What are the signals that tell you this? And how do you move on? Often to the next interaction. So as you can see that there are an awful lot of skills involved here, and all of these children can be helped with. So I'm going to ask Nida a question, which is one way in which we all approach each other. And so while I ask her the question, watch us both closely and make a note in the chat of any non-verbal factors that support our interaction. Hello, Nida. What time did you go to bed last night?
Last night I went to bed around 10:30.
Oh, great. Thank you. So you may have noticed that the words we used had an appropriate pitch, tone, volume, pace of voice that matched the context we were talking about. But the feel of the interaction would have been very different if I had asked a question differently, like, Nida, what time did you go to bed last night? And if Nida had answered, 10:30 a.m. with increased volume and sharpened tone, almost the same words, very different meanings. So the non-verbals in communication are really important to think about and to help children understand. So I hope you noticed that we smiled at each other, we looked at each other, we waited, we listened, and Nida demonstrated an understanding of the words I used through the way she answered me, and she demonstrated an understanding of the turn-taking of the communication, the to and fro, the serve and return. So these are all learnt skills. And so we are using a wide range of communication skills while we have any social interaction. And communication is a really important social skill that includes a lot more than words. So the things I mentioned are the things that you could see and hear. But underneath the words, there are a number of important social understandings that greatly influence our ways of being social. For example, I knew and trusted Nida's intentions, and she knew and trusted mine. And we had a sense of each other's feelings that impact on how we relate to each other. But all the same, I realised that Nida is likely to view the situation right now in a slightly different way to me because we have different perspectives on the world. So we are demonstrating our understanding of the different social rules in this online social world we're in at the moment. And just as there are different social rules at a trivia night at the club, sitting on a plane, or in a busy early childhood setting. So our actions reflect a variety of wants, needs, values and morals learned from the culture and context of our own experience as we grew up. We have also individual ideas of knowing when help is needed, being able to seek help and knowing who to ask for help. This adds another flavour to our social lives, and this is a very important skill for children to develop. Everyone, including children and educators, are at different places in their social understandings, and these flavour their encounters. You can see how much is involved in social interactions from one very small response that we modelled, and how complex this can be. So far we've covered 3 of the processes inside this social interaction we had. We're motivated, we've joined in, we've responded in detail, and now we're up to the 4th one, which is maintaining contact that we mentioned before. So people who are pro-social successfully are more likely to be able to maintain contact. And children who maintain contact well and play in a shared experience together for lengths of time, they have a higher number of serves and returns with other children, and they seek each other out regularly over a period of time. And these children are often sought after by other children because of their play skills, because these are so important. If you maintain contact, you're more likely to be more successful at taking turns, negotiating and cooperating. And it's fascinating to listen to children who are doing this well. Cooperation is another of the key early childhood social skills that I mentioned earlier. There may be more of a chance of maintaining a social relationship over time if there is an emotional investment like you have with a friend. But people who are not necessarily friends can still interact well socially. We can't be friends with everyone, but we do need to be able to interact effectively and be friendly with people. So I often hear people say, we all share here. So what does that mean? Does it mean, for example, that a child has to give up what they're playing with so that another child can have a turn? And I'm sure that all of you could recount experiences of helping young children to share and the strategies that are involved in that. So the 5th process is about knowing when the game changes. What do you do if someone changes the subject in an interaction, or 2 extra children join in play space? This could well involve negotiation or problem solving, or using some of those executive functioning skills that I mentioned earlier. Does a change mean that the interaction's finished, or that it's becoming more complex? Are the participants still motivated? So the last processes, number 6 and 7, of course, are knowing when the interactional game is finished, and how do you move on? How do you know it's finished? Is the finishing your idea or your partner's idea? How are you going to manage the inevitable transition? So underlying this whole process is having the understanding and the ability to act appropriately, as we know that being pro-social is a very strong protective factor for mental health. Some people could be considered to be antisocial if they don't have this ability. So knowing what is appropriate, when and where, and having the ability to self-regulate accordingly is critical. The word appropriate often comes up when talking about emotional, social and behavioural skills. So appropriate to whom? Who decides when it's appropriate? And which bit is inappropriate? So who decides what is appropriate in the workplace? This is our next poll question. Have a think while we get the poll up. Who decides what is appropriate in your setting?
So now we're going to take a look at the poll. Who decides what's socially appropriate in your early childhood setting? Is it the children? Is it the families? Is it the governing bodies? Is it the national quality standards? Is it the director or the school principal? Is it your education? Or is it your educational leader? Or is it somebody else? You can share your ideas in the chat. Or is it the person with most experience or who's been there the longest? So Penny, looking at the poll now, 72% of people responded that it's actually the children who decide what's appropriate in their setting. So children do decide on what is socially appropriate and act on their own values and understanding. What we notice and act on and how we decide to manage this is based on our values and understanding. Some other things you might want to think about in your setting are some skills prioritized over others. For example, is joining in more important than seeking help? Are the experiences you offer children reflecting your priorities, or are they evenly balanced to accommodate learning skills and learning of all skills? How intentional are you about doing something about the things you notice?
Yes, interesting.
So we've covered a lot of ground so far. Penny has helped us explore some of the concepts and ideas about social learning and development. And now we want to return to consider the relationship between social capacity and good mental health. On the slide is a definition of early childhood mental health. You'll notice the highlighted sections refer directly to the social skills we've been exploring today. So participating in the physical and social environment, forming healthy and secure relationships, and interacting appropriately with others. So now we want to move our conversations to what this means for our work with young children, and to explore how we notice children's social capacity, and to think about how we can use intentional teaching strategies to support social development and understanding. The first step is to think about our own social learning and what has influenced us. So let's do another poll now. So this poll talks about I learned to be social. So how did you learn to be social? Was it from your family? Was it from your friends? From school? From media? As a child? As an adult? As a teenager? Or other? So we have just asked you to think about all the influences on your social learning and development. What and how we know to be social is primarily determined by our context. The process of socialization occurs in our lives as we interact with the people and events we encounter. As we can see from the poll responses, there are multiple influences. Some of you may be familiar with the Bronfenbrenner socio-ecological model. This model makes clear that each of us, including children, are active members of this social system, both influencing and being influenced by our context. Our close circles of influence include family, friends, school, early childhood settings. Bronfenbrenner's model suggests that these circles of influence are also related to each other. I'm sure we would agree that family is the main context for children's development, and as it provides the most powerful and enduring influences on short and long-term health and social adjustment. However, our early childhood services and schools are an additional critically important influence on children's learning, socialization, and outcomes throughout adulthood. The context also influences and determines the social rules. The rules or norms are often different in different contexts. You could learn social rules from each of these, but have you ever thought about how you came to know that these were the rules in this place or with these? But have you ever thought about how you came to know that these were the rules in this place or with these people or at this event? We need to think about how children will learn social rules in our settings. And something I've been wondering about is not that children can and do learn different ways of being in many different contexts, but rather what is the process that enables this to occur? Maybe the things we need to find out are how our own contexts shape what we know and value about being social. What are our personal social rules? What social rules of children, our colleagues, and our community? Often these social rules are unspoken, and sometimes the rules haven't been explored or challenged, or there's little or no understanding of why they exist. They are rules because that's how we do things here. Next, we are going to connect these ideas to our work with young children. To help make sense of this complex area, we are going to apply these understandings to a case study. If you haven't read it yet, that's okay. So this is a case study of Siena. Let me introduce Siena. We can see Siena has some social strengths that will provide a strong foundation for her future development. You might like to add the strengths that you've noticed in the chat if you have had a chance to read the case study. We know that from the moment she was born, Siena was people-oriented. Penny has mentioned that research tells us we are hardwired from birth to connect with others, and this continues for our entire lives. Siena and her dad have a close relationship based on mutual respect as they communicate and join with each other. They both have a strong motivation to be social. Siena is learning about being social by experiencing, watching, and practicing relationships with those who are close to her. As Siena grows, her social context expands as she starts childcare. This gives her opportunities to increase her social capacity, and she knows and that she shows that she enjoys connecting with adults, especially giving and receiving hugs and kisses. She uses her trusted adults as a reference point for working out if this is the way it's done here. This shows a desire to cooperate and join in with the group, to fit in and belong. Her rapidly increasing vocabulary supports these connections and relationships. She has words to go with her nonverbal actions. She is beginning to join others and seek help. Siena is also beginning to respond to others based on their needs and wants, and not always hers, sometimes. As a preschooler, Siena's pro-social behavior includes responding to her friends' cues, expressing her ideas and feelings effectively, and making attempts at cooperative play. So I think Siena's communications are really strong, both non-verbal and verbal. She's certainly becoming socially literate. What would you say, Penny?
Yes, looking at Siena's profile, I think it's fascinating to see how strong her communication skills were before she used words, and how central her communication skills were to her social development. So you can see her moving from non-verbal through to words, then full conversations. So it's interesting how other understandings emerged too, and how she used the important adults around her in her life, and how they responded to her. All of these determine the quality of her interactions.
Absolutely, and it really comes down to relationships, doesn't it? We've seen that relationships are integral to Siena's social learning, and we know that relationships are important for good mental health. The early years learning framework has an underpinning principle of secure, respectful, reciprocal relationships. Let's look at the relationships in Siena's life and how they support her social learning. I think the relationship between Siena and her dad shows that getting things right early provides an excellent foundation. Dad is committed to being fully present, not just being around or nearby, but really engaging with her. This is called joining. They have a relationship based on mutual love and back and forth, serve and return. They both notice and respond to each other's cues. These hundreds and hundreds of momentary interactions have taught Siena that this is how relationships work. It has become her internal working model, the reference point from which she can measure all future relationships. It also gives her a sense of herself as a person who's social, who relates to people, and who others want to relate to. Have you got some thoughts, Penny?
Yes, Nida. Did you notice how Kayla was available to Siena when Siena needed her, and how important this is. How Kayla was open to supporting Siena's need for closeness. And did you notice how Siena was open to supporting her peers in a similar way? So she's no doubt learning what to do by observing Kayla. And this is so important in young children's learning.
Absolutely, Penny. And I'm also wondering what we can guess about the relationship between Kayla and Siena's dad. I think we can assume it's an effective partnership. Siena would be observing and watching how they interact with each other, and this adds to her understanding of how to be social. This is called cooperation, communication, and possibly relationship where they seek help from each other to do what's best for Siena. So I wonder if Kayla was intentional about her relationship with Siena, or if it just happened because Siena is one of those children who are easy to develop a relationship with. It is vital that we are intentional about our relationships with all children. So Kayla's intentions may have been to be predictable and available, to be there to respond sensitively to Siena's attempts to initiate interactions and conversations. Kayla could build on this by sitting with Siena and watching others, talking about how they're interacting with each other, giving Siena the words she will use later herself. Kayla could use photos, images, books, and stories to talk with Siena about cooperating, joining, seeking help, and communicating. For Siena the toddler, Kayla could intentionally plan the environment and routine to provide Siena time and space to cooperate, share, and interact with peers, as well as opportunities to be by herself or with Kayla. Toddlers make sense of their social world through pretend play and dramatic play, so lots of opportunities to practice, try out rules and relationship roles, to experience situations from others' perspectives. Kayla may begin to name Siena's initiatives, describing her interactions as a narrative, talking with Siena about how she connects and interacts. For example, I noticed that you really like hugs and kisses. And thinking about Siena in the sandpit, there are a range of possible options. The educator may decide to sit in the sandpit with Siena and her peers and join in with the play, providing language and non-verbal instructions to support Siena's interaction. Or the educator may trust Siena's social capacity that she has demonstrated in other situations and wait, watch, and wonder, noticing and documenting. Or the educator may even have a conversation with Siena about the sandpit and explore the problem and solutions together. For example, by saying, I wonder what you are thinking about it when it's hard to play with the other children in the sandpit. I wonder if you've noticed that it is trickier to play with the other children in the sandpit when you can play so easily in the home corner. Why do you think that is? Let's make a plan for next time. Siena is a confident, engaged social learner. How educators at each stage find ways to make this social learning visible to herself and her family and peers also requires intention. Noticing and documenting Siena's social strengths, talking with her about how she has developed over time. For example, reading her learning journal and with her with a social lens. By saying, let's look at all these stories about you and see all the ways you communicate, cooperate, join in, and seek help. This is a good time to also think about the intentions of the hiding child. Some of the ideas that you came up with in the chat included overwhelmed, frightened, excited, and avoidant. Thinking about his behavior according to his intentions, his thoughts, and feelings would really offer a wider range of ways to support his future social learning.
Nida, there's a couple of questions in the chat which I think be helpful to us to answer. One of them is from Rabia. How could we enhance the social and emotional skills in children with autism attending inclusive settings? And from Zoe, how do you help a child who does not show interest in other people? So I think in answer to those, I think a lot of the things you described about the ways that you might help in that little case study of Siena, those same principles apply to all children. It's just that I think when a child is on the spectrum, they need a lot more scaffolding, perhaps, than other children do. They're not going to pick up some of the social skills as quickly or as easily. And I think one of the things that can really help is that being near them and doing some of the things like naming. So actually naming up their actions, naming up the actions of people around them, noticing things like you talked about in the case study of what's happening to people's faces, why they might be doing that. You're acting almost like a little bit of a social commentator for the child, and gently and quietly and judging from the child how much they're actually taking in, so that you're providing that kind of other voice inside the child's head that probably isn't there, that is helping them to pick up some of those cues from around them.
Absolutely.
Yes, and I think the same applies to a child who doesn't show interest in other people. I think first of all, you've got to help them know what's happening in themselves, so you name up for them what they're doing. Oh, look, when you did that, so-and-so did that, and he's really watching you, he's really interested, and etc. So you provide that little commentary about the social setting and highlight any tiny little things you notice about that child that may have kind of given a hint towards an interaction with another child. So it's that ability to tune in and to read that child. And
absolutely.
Yes.
And also giving them language and allowing them to explore and name how they're feeling and being really intentional about it as well.
Mm. Someone compared this to being a sportscaster. You know, when you're not there at the game, you're listening to the sportscaster, sort of picking up the highlights and things and naming and giving you that added picture of what's happening.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, Penny.
Mm. So we could spend a lot more time, of course, on answering. These are two really big questions, but yes, we can probably come back perhaps a little bit more at the end if we have time.
Yeah, we'll see how we go with time.
Talking further. Okay, thank you.
So we can have a social lens at any time during the day, and with this social lens, we can notice, reflect on, and plan for social learning. Often we leave this important to ad hoc opportunities, and certainly in a group setting, there are many teachable moments. But as we've just been discussing, it is important to be intentional about social learning. The first step is to see the social learning occurring. Let's have a look at these images and discuss the social learning that's already happening and think about what we could do to support the future social learning. And we also welcome you to write your ideas in the chat. So looking at the slide, now we're going to discuss different opportunities for babies and toddlers to learn social skills through interactions with different people and different environments. So we're going to place a link to a baby's talking video, which we were unable to play here, but you can have a look at it in your own time. This very small moment in time illustrates many of the ideas that we've talked about. We've discussed how communication is valued, and this context has provided the opportunity to these very young babies to interact by joining, communicating, and understanding each other. We learned that relationships are critical and that children are already born with social strength and capacity, even in infanthood. And they are being given an opportunity to practice and explore these skills further because the adults around them have intentionally put them together to enable this.
Yes, that's a lovely video, Nida. I hope people get a chance to have a look at that. So in that picture also you can see a plate of food there, and this is just a reminder to us that meal times are really important social context. And I think this is really important to think about when you're in an early childhood setting and the children are having meal times together. How are you going to organise this that will really enhance the social skill learning of children? And we know that there are different social rules or norms for families, especially from different cultures. And we need to learn about these and be sensitive to those, but also at the same time establish what we think is important in our setting. Acknowledging that social rules do change over time and they sometimes need to be negotiated, and importantly, formed with contributions from the children and from other educators and from families. So this is really a community bringing their ideas together to make eating, which is a very central part of human communication and interaction, a very valuable social learning time. And when someone asked that question before about children with challenges and difficulties, I think someone sitting nearby can often be a great help to those children and help them to know exactly what to do in such a sort of setting. So you could have a group of girls, for example, who might be friends and they're sitting together and they gather around the food table, but is being friends, just friends, the goal of social learning, or we've got to be a bit more intentional than that? So is it more like being friendly? So using and learning social skills such as getting along, recognising other people's perspectives, joining in. So nearby adults can be a great help in just prompts and little cues that can help children to think about these things. So mealtimes offer many opportunities for sharing stories, sharing space, sharing food. And I wonder if we see these things as appropriate ways to share. What are our social rules about sharing stories, for example? Are they the same as sharing toys and things? And I'm sure that many of you can relate examples of helping young children to share and what strategies work best to assist with this. Sometimes we overestimate children's developmental level when we do this, but other times we're in tune with their needs and we are able to really help them to see the other's perspective when they're sharing.
Another way of facilitating being social is through pretend play in babies and toddlers and even young children. Because they enjoy pretend play and it also offers a fantastic opportunity for children and adults to join together and allows for the time and opportunity to connect. And through pretend play and engaging with the adults around them, children learn vital social skills. Through being close and through engagement and through making eye contact, smiling, seeking help and cooperating. And even though it's play, pretend play offers great opportunities to learn these vital social skills.
Yes, I'm a great fan of pretend play, and I think that when children, it's one of the areas where they really learn to think how others are thinking, and to really play well with pretend play, you've got to be able to put yourself almost in the mind of the other, and that sort of mindset is a really important skill as you grow up. So yes, I think I agree with you, Nida. So then you can see in the slide there a picture of a bike, and if you have traffic jams with bikes and other things that happen in the playground, this could be a moment where emotional skills might not seem very obvious. But any of you who have worked in settings with bikes will know the considerable social skills that are necessary to keep bike sharing a happy, productive activity. So this is another important teaching, learning time for you to help children. So they can learn to negotiate, to wait, very hard for some children, to take turns, and to understand perspectives and intentions of others. So communicating effectively, as well as being able to manage their own frustration, are all skills which are really important in this sort of setting. So as you can see, all the things we've been talking about being social apply to these very practical settings for children. And the more you are thoughtful and sensitive about this, the more you are ready to do that explicit, intentional teaching and scaffolding that can help children so much. Okay, so at the beginning of our webinar, you saw a slide with some of our ways on it. And one of the things we have to recognise with social learning, as with any other area, is that there are many ways of learning. And we've got to acknowledge these different ways. And when we have children with challenging behaviour, sometimes we've got to really tune into their needs and think carefully about what way of learning is going to be most likely to be successful with them. And that these ways of learning are the ones that we have developed for our team. And we developed them as an initiative after we worked with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander pedagogy, the 8 ways of learning. And so whenever you're thinking about learning or planning for children or for adults or for yourselves, we suggest everyone consider multiple perspectives and approaches, and best support and notice the learning of adults and children alike. So this does take very careful observation. And I always remember Anne Stonehouse's statement that says, the more you know, the more you see. So we can easily miss little signs from children unless we are very aware to the different ways. So you can use these symbols that we've developed. They can be used as a self-reflection tool. How much do I acknowledge, consider, and celebrate? How much do I celebrate the successes of others? Or any little thing that I can see, how much do I actually verbally acknowledge this and say, well done, and describe what the person has done well or the child has done well. So connecting, how strong are our connections? We know that connecting is such an important skill and protective factor in mental health and wellbeing. So the ways we connect are also important, and that really applies to families, as we know how important they are in children's social learning. We need to think not only about knowledge, but also how we feel, how we are, what we're like as people, and what we do, and how we model all the things that we do every day. We know that everyone learns in different ways, so recognise these, think about them. Sometimes think about, are we tending to focus on some particular ways? I think sometimes there are some gender issues here. We're always acknowledging the different ways that children with different gender preferences might want to learn. But we want everyone to grow out of their learning, to keep safe while they're growing. And we know how critical conversational yarning up is to increasing our knowledge and understanding.
Well, we've covered a fair bit of territory today. Some of you may have some questions. Feel free to pop your questions in the chat now. And remember, if you're a participating service, you can get questions in the chat now. And remember, if you're a participating service, you can get in touch with your consultant to get more information on the topics that we've discussed today. Penny, we have a question from Kate. Any recommendations on how to support children who like to control play and how they play with their friends? Would you like to respond to that, Penny?
I think, again, I always think that you start with feelings first, so that it helps the child to acknowledge how they're feeling in a particular setting. So you have to start almost with being able to name up, like if the child who is trying to snatch that away from another child, when you were doing that, how were you feeling? I mean, they may say things that, the opposite of what you want to hear, but it gives you an opening to explore, well, how might that child be feeling? And how might that child be feeling? And let's watch so-and-so and so-and-so. See that Billy's really happy face because John has so kindly let him use X. And so, again, that narrating, that commenting, that naming, recognising the child's own feelings. I think you always have to start with that. Look, I know you really want to do that. You want Billy to do that. But let's have a think about how Billy might be feeling. And what other way could you do this? I wonder if you could do this over here. So giving them another opportunity, distracting in some way. So the adult is that constant scaffolder, commentator, giving the child the language. It's going to help them connect their behaviour with other ways of being, I think, is the kind of thing that I'd be thinking about. Of course, as I said before, this is an enormous area. I mean, you could spend so long on talking about all the skills and the strategies you can use in social learning, and we've got only a little tiny moment in time to do this. But we will have some references that we share with people, and that can take you into looking at some of these things in a little bit more detail. What would you add to that, Nida?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with whatever you just said, Penny. And also, it's about teaching empathy. And I really like the way you word it, scaffolding, and as an adult, providing them that space and opportunity to learn while they're learning about important skills like empathy and resilience, and as well as taking turns as well. I've just had a comment from Zoe. Yes, it's very difficult to engage children who tend not to focus on people. They are not looking so difficult to talk about behaviors, faces, body language.
Yes, I think it's always going to be a challenge with some children, but I think if we constantly remind ourselves how all of the different little skills are involved in successful social interaction, just like we talked about earlier in the webinar, I think it reminds us that there's an awful lot to learn here, and that if children are behaving in ways that are not helpful to them, then it is our responsibility to try and break down what it is they're doing and to model, to teach, to encourage, to really do it in a positive way. Any tiny little skill they are showing, and build on that as their starting point, but not just to leave it and say, oh, well, they're just not very good at making friends or whatever it might be. We can't leave it at that. These skills are so fundamental that I think it's a major responsibility of early childhood educators to know how to persist, persevere, and help children develop these skills, and to seek advice and help from colleagues and literature and other things if we're not quite sure how to do this.
Absolutely. So Penny, I thought I knew lots about social learning, but I've discovered that there's still so much more to learn. When you stop it, think and reflect deeply with others, you can discover and notice what you don't know.
Yes, I agree, Nida. And
so what will be your top tip for today?
Well, I think my top tip really is supporting social learning by strengthening relationships, because it all starts there. Our relationships are our strategy, and we need to know what the skills are involved in establishing positive relationships, and then how to use these skills. And remember that strengthening relationships have consequences that reach far beyond social learning in childhood. They are laying the foundations for lifelong well-being. And if we remember that, we really value our role and acknowledge how critical we are to the lives of children and families. So thanks, Nida. I think we probably need to move to our last slide now.
Yeah.
So these webinars are a great way to learn and to reflect and to find out how to put learning into action. And we've tried to make that link for you today. But they also assist in demonstrating your individual commitment to continued professional development. So well done to all of you who participated today and demonstrated your own commitment, because professional learning is absolutely fundamental to helping us to improve our practice. So where more than one member of staff of a service or a school participates in a webinar like this, the learning you gain from the webinar really helps you to learn together. So we'd encourage wherever people can to join in a webinar with more than one person from their service. And whole of service or school learning is an asset in planning and demonstrating what you're going to do to meet the National Quality Standard requirements and in achieving the goals that you set in your quality improvements or your site improvement plans. So our consultants are available to assist all our participating services or our schools to create connections between their mental health related learning and any other requirements, areas of focus they have in their service. So sign your service or school up and attend a Getting Started event. Don't forget to mention that you've attended this webinar. And for those of you who are already from a participating or service or school, let your consultants know what you've learnt and acted on after this webinar. So it could be all you need to finish one of our professional learning topics and receive a certificate for completion. Remember to also let the consultants know when you attend one of our small group check-in events. Once you let them know how you have turned learning into action, This might also help you to get a certificate for topic completion. So, if you have not already registered to be a participating school or service, please do so as soon as possible. You'll find the link in the chat. If you're already from a participating service or school, join a check-in event to get great ideas or share what you have learned and done to support mental health and wellbeing. And do it soon. So, to finish off, thank you very much for joining our webinar today and for the feedback you have willingly shared in the chat and in our polls. Nida and I will be leaving shortly, but we'd like you to complete the survey which will appear on your screens, as we very much value your feedback. So thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for attending.